Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Betsy McShane, and I am the state biologist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service here in New Jersey. And I'd like to welcome you to the third session of our Working Lands for Wildlife webinar Wednesday series. I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Kati DePaola is joining us as a stewardship specialist from New Jersey Audubon. She currently works in varied habitats, but got her start in the grasslands of South Dakota as a plague crew member with USGS. And yes, that meant dealing with fleas and prairie dogs. While watching sunrises over the plains, she discovered her love for the country's grasslands and the birds that call them home, even on migratory routes. She has worked alongside USDA programs for 7 years, primarily with Working Lands for Wildlife, but also in a partner capacity with habitat organizations such as Quail Forever and the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture. Kati has gotten to live and learn from dynamic habitats in Ohio, Maryland, Texas, and New Mexico, and feels there is not one catch-all solution to conservation. Since moving back home to the New Jersey, Pennsylvania region, she's grown more passionate about conserving and managing habitat for both people and animals to thrive, and is very excited to educate tonight about grassland birds and quail in New Jersey. Thank you for sharing your information with us, Kati, and we look forward to your presentation.
All right, great. Thank you, Betsy, and good evening, everyone. I really appreciate that introduction, as well as NRCS for kind of hosting this platform, as well as all of our other partner organizations who are a part of this webinar series. I do want to kind of highlight also going forward, so I'm smack in the middle of these presentations, but we've got a few more coming up in the next few weeks, and if you haven't gotten a chance to register for any of the ones you're interested in, go ahead back to that Eventbrite page. You should have gotten an email from them tonight to join this webinar, and go ahead and register for any ones that you find interesting. And then, of course, these presentations will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, and I think most of the partner pages here. So, and then also just some quick housekeeping things. Please go ahead and mute your mics if you haven't done so already. And if you can, turn your cameras off. I know my internet's kind of slow, so hopefully fewer cameras will keep any interruptions to a minimum. I also do want to warn that I have a very opinionated dog, so hopefully she doesn't sound off at any point during this presentation, but if she does, hopefully she runs in the opposite direction and we don't hear her too much, but want to apologize in advance if that happens. I'll also go ahead and say, please feel free to add any of your questions in the chat as I present. I know for me personally, I can never remember my questions when I get to the end of a presentation, and once they open the floor, I forget everything I wanted to ask about. So feel free to do that. My coworker Hunter or Betsy should be able to see that chat and ask those at the end if you don't feel comfortable coming off mic as well. So as Betsy mentioned in her introduction, we're going to be focusing a lot on the Northern Bobwhite, but also any of the other grassland species that kind of call this habitat home and can utilize this habitat, as well as the restoration work that really goes into managing the landscape for quail. So once again, I work for New Jersey Audubon. We are a nonprofit, one of the oldest in the state, but we have multiple facets. So I come from the stewardship team, which does a lot of the restoration work, habitat work, and focuses on a lot of those key species in the state. But we also have an education team, a research team. We have nature centers that you can go and visit, and public events. So we host a lot of festivals. We do a World Series of birding in the spring. That's really fun. Kind of a community science project tracking birds as they migrate along the Atlantic Flyway. So if you're in New Jersey, please feel free to check us out. Our website is pretty readily accessible and has a ton of information on it. We've been in this state for over 125 years and really just support the mission of helping people in the community, thrive with nature in New Jersey. So kind of along that vein, New Jersey has a pretty long and storied interest in quail. We have one of the few successful translocation projects in partnership with New Jersey DEP, excuse me, University of Delaware, and Tall Timbers, as well as the Pine Island Cranberry Company. So this project took place between 2015 and 2018. We released around 300 birds on a property that was pretty heavily managed for quail. So I do want to kind of highlight Pine Island. They hosted the project. Their land was the site for the release of birds. They did just an immense amount of land management. And this is really one of those standout projects that shows both the intensity of work that is required, but also really the potential of habitat work in the state. Feel free to check out that QR code. It kind of goes into full detail about the work we did, as well as kind of the outcomes of that project. We're still posting research from this project, which I'll kind of dive into a little bit more later. But it really did kind of highlight what needs to go into a project like this and really further our understanding of habitat restoration in the state for quail and other grassland birds. All right, so we'll do a little general quail species biology for those of you that aren't familiar and have not spent your time focusing on these very tiny and very characteristic birds of the kind of grassland hunting group that a lot of people are very excited about. So it is an early successional game bird, meaning that it's kind of that like post-bare cleared ground off of a crop field, but before you get to thick forest stand that you can't walk through, much like a lot of the pine barrens. Their habitat is what some would call like a mosaic structure. So they need grasses for nesting, particularly those kind of like bunch grasses where they can lay their eggs at the base of that clump and it can be protected from other things trying to eat them. Shrubs for cover, so they like to flush. I don't know if you've ever walked through a field. They will scare the pants off of you if you're not expecting them to be there because they burst out of the ground really quickly and then they fly for cover to get away. So they kind of want to avoid predators by hiding in those shrubby mats. And then seed producing plants for their forage. And then, of course, enough bare ground that they can move around. So an adult quail is really no bigger than an adult fist. Some of the males can get a little meatier, but not really. They're a pretty small bird. And when they're young or born, they're actually no bigger than the size of your thumb or a bumblebee, some people like to say. So they really need that bare ground structure because they can fly for short distances, but they're not really a soaring bird. They don't migrate, so they're kind of stuck where they're born. And then as far as their range goes, so the New Jersey pinelands are kind of at the top of their range. And this habitat changes a little bit across the range, which can spread down to Texas, into the Southeast and the Midwest. It really just depends on the local vegetation, but those kind of core four components are the same of those, grasses, bare ground, shrubs, and cover for nesting and seed production. To get a little more specific for how that kind of fits into New Jersey and particularly the pinelands, a farm or agricultural edge is still kind of a possibility. A lot of people will talk about hedgerows or kind of those like shrubby corners. But a lot of our focal work has really taken place in the pinelands. The acidic sandy soils really do lend themselves to a more bare ground understory. And with specific forest management, we can open up that canopy and facilitate habitat that works for quail and other species. We'll talk a little bit more about the actual species in addition to quail that this can kind of benefit, as well as practices specific to the pine barrens that work for quail a little bit later. But just to kind of give you a preview, prescribed fire, selective thinning, and feathered edges are all kind of good practices that we would look to help facilitate this bird's habitat. All right, so I talked about their super wide range across the state and the country, but inevitably when I go on a site visit, I get some variation of this question or a generally person my grandfather's age telling me that they used to see quail all the time and don't see them anymore. And at the risk of oversimplifying, I'm just going to kind of focus on these couple facets of kind of loss of quail population over time. So the first one, fire suppression and overstocked forest. So fire, prescribed fire particularly, can be a really great tool for habitat management when it's used effectively. But in the instance of something like a wildfire, it can cause significant property damage, a lot of public fear, which I don't blame people. I've been in states where wildfires are a huge issue. Obviously, here we had a lot last year due to the drought conditions. They are not fun to deal with. And so, you know, through either, unfortunately, arson or accidental environmental ignition, it's extremely valid to be afraid of these things. But that has led to a pretty significant effort to suppress fire across the landscape, which is, again, extremely valid. We do not like property damage. We do not like anyone getting hurt. So understand the instinct there. But all of that has a, you know, a reaction when you put that in the system. So therefore, the lack of fire has led to a really dense forest succession and a lot of unsuitable habitat, both for quail and other birds, but other species as well. And it's just kind of led to an imbalance in habitat structure across the pine barrens. Moving on to that middle one, so efficiencies in agriculture as well as development, they kind of go hand in hand. So as I mentioned earlier, people talking about, you know, their hedgerows between their farms, that's where they used to see quail all the time. As we started to get more and more efficient with our farming practices, which is, again, great. All of those things are great for people who own land. We kind of lost those corners that were maybe not ideal. We lost those hedgerows, and individually on their own, those hedgerows probably weren't sustaining large populations. But combined with kind of the loss of other edges and habitat from other adjoining farms, as well as pressure from housing and other development, we kind of start to lose that habitat. It becomes more fragmented and harder for those birds to utilize. Because remember, they're very small. They're not flying long distances to other habitat. They kind of have to walk everywhere they go. And then my last one, which is, again, one I hear a lot, is about predators. So this was a really big one when I heard it, or when I lived in Maryland. I worked as a working lands biologist down there. And it's really kind of a byproduct of the other two. So I'm not going to say that predators aren't a problem and that, you know, predator pressure isn't an issue. But really, if there is good habitat with escape cover, with more spread out nesting sites available, it's going to become a lot harder for, you know, that fox, for example, to run through that habitat quickly and pick off a bunch of nests. I always joked, especially down in Texas, everything wants to eat quail, including us. They're very tasty, but they get heavily predated. So the need for habitat there is really their key chance at surviving. Which brings me to this slide. So there you can see that range kind of across the plains as well as down to the southwest into the southeast. And we're kind of at the top of that range. I'm sure this visual won't be much of a surprise to anyone if you've maybe seen or heard a quail previously and you don't hear them anymore. I do think it highlights kind of the overall population loss, which is, yes, all of that red, and that this is not a unique situation to New Jersey or even the edges of the range, right? So a lot of times, you know, or city populations, right? It is kind of across that whole range that they had loss of population. I will say, though, there are kind of pockets of hope and work throughout that range. And these maps are also a little old. So, take that into account. But we've been studying these birds for a really long time, and there's a lot of organizations and individuals who are really, really passionate about the birds and the habitat. And that's what we really want to focus on, is that like every little bit and every little bit of work and people caring about this and trying to connect habitat is really the key to kind of helping these species survive, as well as other species that utilize their habitat as well. All right. So I kind of touched on these in a couple slides ago, but I just want to reiterate that these kind of really seem to be the top challenges we face, especially in New Jersey. So fragmentation, again, going back to that kind of shrinking of suitable habitat to become almost these little islands, both within development or within agricultural fields, and difficult space to travel in between. So I'm not sure if anyone has seen the New Jersey landscape tool. That's also a really helpful one, or the change tool. That one can that's through New Jersey DEP, can kind of show you like the ability of species to move between suitable habitat. Just want to highlight that. It's also a really cool tool to use when you're just kind of looking around the state for conservation efforts and initiatives. But so that becomes a real issue for them, and that habitat gets fragmented, and it's really hard for them to kind of establish and thrive if they only have little pockets to exist in. The other one, it seems similar, but this is more on a restoration end, is that connectivity. So connectivity really becomes an issue when we have one really passionate landowner, but their habitat alone isn't really enough to support a quail comeback. So maybe they have, 50 acres that they're managing either in really great grasslands or a pine savanna, like you can kind of see on the right side of this photo. But them alone is not enough, and them alone is not enough to transfer birds to their property. Excuse me, I found that the most successful projects tend to be neighbors who are all very excited to manage their land in the same way. But if any of you are a neighbor, probably me just saying that sentence made you go, yeah, right. So that's kind of a challenge, is getting enough people grouped together who can kind of piece that habitat together, almost like a patchwork, to create a larger swath of habitat. And then obviously succession. So forests, or bare ground, if you leave it to its own devices and don't continually manage it, that right side of that photo starts to look a lot like that left side of that photo. And so that it's just a continued maintenance. And for some people that's, great, and this is what they're really excited about and they want to do the work. And some people that's pretty daunting. And then obviously invasives, this is not a unique problem to quail or forests or anything really in the conservation space. Plants and animals really that aren't supposed to be there tend to thrive in environments where they're a little unstable or out of balance. But even things that aren't necessarily like from other places, they can just be things that are native to here. But again, when that forest management gets out of balance, those things tend to take over. Some of the blueberries and greenbrier, right? They're not necessarily invasive. They're from here. They're a native plant. But they can really start to cause that like closed understory that becomes a problem for habitat. All right. So I promise that this is my last bummer slide, as I call them. We'll go back up after this on the other end. So translocation, which is what we did on our large project in the Pine Barrens at Pine Island Cranberry, that usually kind of gets cited as the goal of anyone's restoration plan. So again, that patchwork, trying to get 1,000 approximately acres of connected habitat, again, working with your neighbors, or if you happen to be fortunate enough to own that much land that you're willing to manage for quail. And if you're in an area where, like New Jersey, people really haven't seen quail for a while, so even if you manage the habitat, there's no promise that they're going to move in there. This does make sense. This is a viable option. But I do just kind of want to note that these projects can require some really intense habitat management. And if folks have wild birds, which generally tall timbers is a huge, I'll call them a stocking resource for wild birds that they translocate. A lot of times they don't want to send them off without, kind of checking your work and making sure you're committed to that continued management and kind of following their requirements for translocating birds. And then that other one is climate differences by region. So we actually noticed when we translocated birds, again, they came from Georgia. We had to do a lot of work to get them acclimated to a New Jersey winter. And of course, they're wild, so you're hands off. You kind of have to do what you can to support and kind of bolster their survival, but you also don't want to interfere heavily because, they're wild. They're supposed to thrive here theoretically in their habitat. So it's kind of a tricky balancing act between those two. But we're still learning, like I said, still learning things from this project. But I do just want to note that for anyone who thinks like, oh, well, I'll just do this and then I'll release birds on my property and it'll be really good. I do also want to mention that pen-raised birds, I, again, had this issue pretty heavily down in Maryland, where people would, for hunting or recreation, which is absolutely valid, you can do that, release pen-raised birds, but they don't necessarily have the instincts to survive. Quail on their own have a pretty boom and bust population cycle. Even wild birds in a thriving habitat, we kind of losing 80% isn't a crazy number every year. Again, going back to that, everything likes to eat them. And I love them and think they're very cute, but they're not the brightest bird. So kind of following that trajectory, we tend to lose a lot of birds anyway. So pen-raised birds aren't usually a sustainable way to kind of foster a population because they're not necessarily raised with those instincts. They were hatched in a chicken coop essentially. So just want to mention that. But like I said, we're trending back up. So, all of those bummer slides for why quail are kind of a lot to manage for and require a lot of work. Why do we do it then? So as we've kind of alluded to, or not even alluded to, we've been pretty obvious about, this is the Working Lands for Wildlife webinar series. And Working Lands for Wildlife focal species are usually picked because they are kind of poster children for their habitat. So I always really love this visual. QF released it. It's kind of calling them the umbrella species. So we kind of say their specialization within their habitat is really so crucial that if we're managing for them, they're theoretically either the poster child or the most finicky, depending on how you want to say it. And it'll be really good for other species in that habitat to get to use it. So just a couple of examples. So our shrubland bird species, obviously indigo bunting, prairie warbler, field sparrows, blue-winged warblers, brown thrashers, eastern towhees. These are all very cool birds. A lot of them migratory. So it's a little hard to get people to care about them. Our deeply obsessed birders will be kind of probably offended that I said that. I do love them. They're great. But it is a little, kind of not many people carrying a banner for birds like this, or our pollinators, if people even think about them, they're always kind of those background species. And then our reptiles and amphibians, which again, I love all of these species, but it's a little harder to get someone to spend a lot of money and time and resources on their property for a corn snake. I'm not saying it. I think they're great. But so yeah, that's kind of if you have that poster child that people can easily recognize, it's very helpful to be able to kind of manage that habitat. And then of course, with the hope that that poster child species comes back eventually. That would be the ideal situation. So a little bit kind of back into our discussion and narrowing it down more for New Jersey. So the habitat types I'm kind of highlight here. I'm highlighting them as individual habitat types, but hopefully there's kind of some mixture of all three of them in one location. But they, again, also have all of their benefits individually, especially for those other umbrella species. So the first one is kind of our open, I'll call it mixed herbaceous grasslands. So I think if you think grasslands, you kind of think, again, those sweeping plains where it's just a sea of moving grass. But there's really a lot more going on there when you get down onto a micro level. Um, Again, going back to those quail specifically, we kind of like those native warm season grasses. They tend to do a little better in those sandier soils. They're a little more drought tolerant. So they also lend themselves a little bit more towards that bare ground space in between. A lot of them are bunch grasses, which again is great for quail, as well as other species. Um, there's also should be a good mixture of forbs, which are your seed producing or flowering plants. So this has a lot of great pollinator benefit, as well as seed production for birds and other um, seed eating things. But then also with the addition of attracting a lot of pollinators, if you do have nesting quail, um, their young really need a lot of that, crude protein pretty early on. So that's another side benefit to that. The next habitat, which is kind of a transitional one between this and forest land, is the scrub shrub habitat. So again, you're going to hear me mention a lot about native species. So when you talk about establishing these habitats or restoring these habitats, you kind of want to go with what should be there. And I say should in the sense that like has been there since that habitat was kind of created. Because that is theoretically going to be the best for the species that want to utilize it. So your quail, you want your native warm season grasses that they're used to seeing. You want shrubs that are local to the area. And these shrubs are going to kind of form those mats for cover. So they're going to bunch up, be able for quail to dive into them, or other, again, grassland birds to use them as rest stops during migration or nesting. So those are all very beneficial. This is one of the habitat types we tend to establish a lot more. So those grasslands are pretty, I'll say, I don't want to say easy because none of it is super easy. But those grasslands, you kind of come up with a seed mixture, you establish that on bare ground. That's great. The shrub plantings tend to be a little bit more intensive because you need to kind of locate shrubs that are local. That in the bottom right is from a tree and shrub planting we did, I believe, at one of our state parks that we work with. So yeah, that's one of the habitat types you can kind of help establish as an intermediary in between. And then the final one, again, that's pretty good for quail and that we can kind of focus on in New Jersey is this pine savanna. I'll say pine savanna, but also kind of intersperse this with an oak savanna pines again because of the pine barrens. You're a little more tended towards those pine species. So this one is also probably one of the ones that, unless you're burning establishment, and even then you are going to need to do a lot of thinning as well, just because of how thick the pine barrens can be. So this is one of the ones that's a little bit more intensive to establish, and it is going to kind of require speaking to a forester and a biologist and talking to people who can help you create this habitat. But as you can kind of see, it's characterized by pretty sparse tree cover. Again, that ratio will really depend on the species you're interested in. And then an understory that's comprised of those grasses and shrubs and kind of a mixed canopy height as well as kind of diverse species makeup. So going right into that forest management, I do kind of want to focus specifically on New Jersey, but I'm also going to caveat and say that as you heard from Betsy's introduction, I know a lot about grasses. I know less about trees. So I was kind of started my career in an area where trees were something just to get rid of. We didn't really focus on good trees. We just focused on getting rid of every other tree out there because chances are it was probably invasive. So I'm going to say this and say that I highly encourage you to contact your local forester or your local NRCS office or other land managers. New Jersey Audubon also has a great forestry team with some people who can really help you reach these objectives if you're interested in them. But that's my caveat. So don't ask me a ton of questions about trees. I might panic. So just quick starting off is kind of this like feathered edge type habitat. So this really reduces those hard habitat lines between things. So I see this a lot when I'm out driving around, especially in southern New Jersey, where we have a lot of agricultural lands. You'll see almost a wide open cornfield and then an immediate forest edge. So that can be pretty rough for some of our species to go from one habitat to the other. A lot of states will focus on putting in wildlife habitat buffers between those. They're great for a lot of things, water quality, soil health, but they also create kind of this zone to transition between, hard habitat lines of the forest going right into an open field. So just a more gradual landscape. You can really play with a lot of shrubs and grasses and things in here. So that can be really cool to see a lot of different dynamic species utilize this. Again, this is kind of that rough corner or that hedgerow that a lot of old agricultural fields used to have for quail. So kind of trying to recreate that habitat here. Like I said, you can thin, depending on how dense your forest is, you can thin to create this habitat, or you can kind of plant that shrub, grassland transitional zone. It just depends on how you want to do that. Another one that, again, I go back to talking about fire suppression. The opposite of that is prescribed fire. So, and I'm going to be very strict on this, that is under the supervision of a prescribed burn plan. And in the state of New Jersey, the State Forest Fire Service oversees all of that. And this really can be an effective tool to, I've used it for a lot of different things. So a lot of times it helps, one, just reset that succession. But if you have a lot of understory that would be kind of expensive or difficult to get into with a forestry mower or things like that, it can be a tool to kind of thin that out. But again, the different habitat objectives really depend on your seasonality and how intense the burn was. And this is something you should talk to a forester or someone from Forest Fire Service about, just how to meet those objectives that you're looking to achieve on your land, depending on what you want to do there can kind of depend on seasonality. At least in New Jersey, we don't really burn too much outside of that February to April timeframe. That's when conditions are generally, I'm going to say easiest to predict, but at least safest, and we can kind of set a prescribed burn plan that we have the lower risk of it getting out of control. We have done some growing season burns kind of in the summer. Again, that achieves a different objective on your habitat, but you would just have to talk to a forester or a Forest Fire Service personnel. And then the last one I want to talk about, and I do apologize about this picture. It came out of one of our reports from that Pine Island cranberry restoration work, but it does just kind of show a little bit of the work that was done on that property. So I do want to highlight that. But this is kind of reducing your density based on specific species requirements. So again, talking to a forester or someone from New Jersey DEP about what objectives you're trying to achieve, and then we can kind of work backwards from there to tailor a plan and kind of the work that would need to go into that to achieve this. Obviously, this looks pretty intense and pretty bare bones. Like we really went in there and thinned the heck out of that. They do not all have to look that extreme. Again, it really just depends on the species requirements that you're trying to manage for. And with that kind of going into that management, I've kind of been brought up in this very intensive conservation management sphere. So I've heard a lot of people say, conservation is not preservation. It really does require continued maintenance. We can't just set it and forget it. The unfortunate thing about succession is that it does mean that it just keeps going. It will succeed to the next habitat type that follows. Um, so a lot of times we have to reset, we have to do active management. We kind of have to adjust based on what we learn. So, if we, in some instances, have lit fires, and then, there's a drought the following year, that's going to really change how that land gets managed in the following years. Or if we've mowed or thinned pretty aggressively and then, an invasive comes back up, we're going to have to deal with that as well. So, that's just kind of a general rule for managing land. You're unfortunately never done, but it is worthwhile work. And I just want to say that New Jersey Audubon is really dedicated to helping landowners find ways to manage their land and create habitats that we can all, continue to thrive together, which is our vision. But other partner organizations in this group are also really, really excited to help you out on their land. We all want to see land that is good for both, species as well as people going forward. So that being said, I do want to highlight a couple outreach opportunities we have coming up. New Jersey Audubon is hosting a conservation planning fair. There'll be one event in South Jersey down in Millville, and then one event up north in kind of Hackettstown area. We're still solidifying some details, so keep an eye on our website. We will be available and posting information on there shortly. But this planning fair is going to kind of be a lot of the partners on this call who are giving presentations are going to be there to kind of talk about what you can do on your land. And you'll have an opportunity to meet and greet with them individually, print out maps of your land if that's available, and then go and talk to them about kind of what you can do. So short of a site visit, right? It's kind of meeting up locally to talk about things, without having to go out and walk your property, which is a very valuable tool, but not everyone has time for that. So with that, I'll go back to the slide because it's pretty. With that, I've kind of said all I needed to say. I don't know if any folks put questions in the chat or had questions that they wanted to come off mute and ask, but that concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was wonderful. Such information that is really helpful to our landowners here in New Jersey. And I'd like to invite our participants, if you do have a question and would like to come off of mute, feel free to and ask Katie your questions. Katie, we don't have any questions in the chat right now, but we'll give it a couple minutes. And if anybody online would like to share a story or ask a question, feel free to do so now.